Hello, my friend. Welcome to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here. I know I say that every time, and I genuinely mean it every time. I'm going to continue to say it. That's how much it means to me, you guys. Seriously, every time you listen, every time you tune in, every time you watch, you're genuinely helping a guy chase his childhood dream and try to a passion into a career. So, seriously, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. This is episode 4 of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football Podcast. Episode 2 was a fantasy football preview of the Buffalo Bills. Episode 3 was a fantasy football preview of the Miami Dolphins. So if you haven't caught on by now, I am starting a 32-team series where I'm previewing each one of them from a fantasy football standpoint, and we're starting this thing with the AFC East. Now, today, we're going to focus in on yet another team that has quite a few question marks from a fantasy football perspective, or at least as it pertains to what to expect from a fantasy football perspective in 2022. We're going to start out with the New England Patriots, and last year was year 1 of the Mac Jones era, and it was chock full of surprises. Last year's Patriots finished 10-7. They clinched a playoff spot. They did get blown out in the wild card round, but that was against the now Super Bowl favorite Bills. But the fact that they were even in the wild card game, the fact that they even finished 10-7 with a rookie quarterback not named Tom Brady is a testament to the greatest coach of all time, Bill Belichick. I think it was a surprise to anybody that they made it that far in a very loaded AFC conference, which is even better this year. They scored the 6th most points, which is a surprise because they weren't really the most explosive offense or the most dominant offense, but still, they scored the 6th most points at about 27.2 per game. They had the 9th most first downs, which is relevant for any of you fantasy football players who are in those increasingly popular point per first down leagues. They had about 21.3 first downs per game. The most impressive thing, or at least in my opinion, the most impressive statistic when you look at the New England Patriots and how surprising last year was, they had the 2nd best scoring percentage in all of football by far. They scored on 48% of their offensive drives, and they did that with a rookie quarterback not named Tom Brady. And you know, with that, the rookie quarterback that we're talking about wasn't Trey Lance, it wasn't Justin Fields, it wasn't Trevor Lawrence, it wasn't one of those top name rookie quarterbacks. It was a guy that a lot of people thought was the on the lower end of that rookie tier. So the fact that they scored on 48% of their drives and were the 2nd best in football, I think that's the cherry on top of a ultimately surprising year 1 campaign for Mac Jones and the New England Patriots. Now, last year's Pats, dominant on the ground. They were absolutely dominant on the ground. They were meh through the air. They were just, kind of mediocre. But that's to be expected with a rookie quarterback and, again, not Tom Brady. So on the ground, they had the 8th most rushing attempts in football. They ran the ball about 29 times per game. They had the 8th most rushing yards in football at about 127 yards per game. And they had the 4th most rushing first downs, getting about 8 every single game. Now, what made them so extremely dominant on the ground is that they ran for 24 rushing touchdowns, which was the 2nd most in all of football. The average, by the way, for NFL teams last year was about 16 rushing touchdowns, and the year before that was about 17 rushing touchdowns. And the Patriots ran for 24 touchdowns this year and 20 rushing touchdowns the year before that. So obviously a very dominant team on the ground, at least in the red zone, at least when they're trying to punch it in. And clearly it works if they're scoring on 48% of their drives. Through the air, much different story, right? They weren't bad, but they were mediocre at absolute best. And again, that's to be expected with a rookie quarterback. They had the 8th fewest passing attempts, so not a very pass-heavy team at all. Definitely a run-heavy team. We already established that they had the 8th most rushing attempts. But they had the 8th fewest passing attempts at about 32 per game, which makes it really interesting when you think about, okay, they had the 8th fewest passing attempts, but they had the 14th most passing yards, 227-ish per game, and they had the 15th most passing touchdowns at 24. So very, very efficient. They're not throwing the ball a lot, yet they're in the top half of the league in both yardage and passing touchdowns. ultimately a great sign for year 2 of Mac Jones and year 2 for the New England Patriots under Mac Jones. Now, looking forward to 2022, they have the full returning cast. Somehow they have lost just 59 targets, 56 of which went to running backs, and that was mostly Brandon Bolden, who followed Josh McDaniels over to Las Vegas and the Las Vegas Raiders. So somehow they lost just 59 targets, right? A lot of teams have had some turnover in the wide receiver room, the tight end room. Not the Patriots. They lost basically just Brandon Bolden and a couple running backs, and that was it. So they're bringing back Jakobi Meyers, Nelson Aguilar, Kendrick Bourne, Hunter Henry, basically the full squad. They are potentially getting back James White, although it looks like he's going to be starting the season on the PUP list. They traded for DeVante Parker, their division rival from the Miami Dolphins. They used their second-round draft pick on Tyquan Thornton. They used their fourth-round draft pick on Pierre Strong. And again, they're bringing back their full supporting cast that they had last year. So there's no way that the arrow is not pointing straight up on the New England Patriots and the New England Patriots offense, and it's going to have to continue to improve if they're going to continue to keep pace with the rest of the AFC and how loaded that conference looks like it'll be over the next decade. Now, one assumption that I'm operating on as I look at the New England Patriots from a 2022 standpoint and from a projection standpoint, you have to think in his second year, Mac Jones is going to have a longer leash. Bill Belichick's going to let it loose a little bit more here in 2022. Now, the Patriots threw the ball about 32 times per game last season. The NFL average was about 34.4 passes per game. They ran the ball 29 times per game last season, and the league average, was about 26.6. So if we assume that the play is going to be a little bit closer to balanced, a little bit closer to 50-50, right? A little bit less running and a little bit more passing. And if they play at a similar pace where they were getting about 62 plays per game, they'd be in about the same company as last year's New York Giants and Detroit Lions. Now, I told you that the Patriots had about, 29 rushing attempts per game last year. Both the Giants and the Lions had 25 rushing attempts per game. The Patriots threw the ball 32 times per game, and the Giants and the Lions both had about 35 passing attempts per game, right? So it might seem like a small difference when we're only talking about 3 or 4 rushing or passing attempts per game, but you add that up over an 18-game season, and it makes, or a 17-game season, and it makes a huge difference. It adds up. It absolutely matters, especially when we're talking about fantasy football, when the only thing that matters is numbers. Okay, so the TLDR, the nutshell of the assumption that we're working with here is that the Patriots are a little less run-heavy and a little bit more pass-heavy, especially if they're going to be trying to keep up with the rest of the AFC. Now, from a player standpoint, let's start with Big Mac. We'll start with Big Mac Jones, right? The arrow is only pointing up there. There's nothing that's happened this offseason that would lead anybody to believe that the arrow's pointing down. Now, last year he finished as the QB 19. He averaged a meager 13.4 points per game, and again, that was in his rookie campaign. He landed in about the middle of the pack across the board statistically when you think about yards, completions, touchdowns. Except running. We know he's not much of a rushing threat, and he was towards the bottom of the pack in running, but he's a quarterback, so that's okay. He hit 20 or more fantasy points in just 18.8% of his games and never once hit 25 points. Again, all of that's okay. We're talking about a rookie quarterback here on a team that didn't throw the ball very much. Now, if you increase his passing volume, like I said, is the assumption that I'm working under. So if you expect an increase in passing volume, you have the full returning supporting cast from last year. You have a boost in that supporting cast with DeVante Parker, Tyquan Thornton, etc. You have his own professional development as a young quarterback. You add all of those things together, there's no reason to not expect improvement across the board for Mac Jones. Now, when you look at 2022 fantasy drafts for Mac Jones, he's currently the QB 23, right? Obviously, that's interesting considering it was the QB 19 last year and should improve this year, theoretically. He's drafted around pick 172, which is in the 15th round. I'm perfectly fine with that cost, and that might even be a value, especially when you consider he was the QB 19 last year. The challenge is removing some of the names that typically get drafted in front of him in early fantasy football leagues. For example, Daniel Jones and Ryan Tannehill both are drafted ahead of Mac Jones in fantasy football leagues. And they are absolutely guys that I would prefer over Mac Jones in a typical redraft league. There's better upside there with both Daniel Jones and with Ryan Tannehill. However, in a best ball league where there's a possibility that Daniel Jones and Ryan Tannehill are not the starters for the whole season, and if you're not familiar with best ball leagues, there's no transactions allowed. You can't add players, you can't drop players, you can't trade players. Whoever you drafted is on your team for all 18 games. So guys like Daniel Jones and Ryan Tannehill, who could theoretically lose their starting job before the season's over, those guys have less value than somebody like Mac Jones, who's likely to hang on to that starting job his whole season. But that being said, QB 23 sounds cheap for Mac Jones, but there's so many names in front of him that are hard to take after Mac Jones. So in a typical one quarterback league, your regular style fantasy football league, I'm not even bothering to spend a draft pick on Mac Jones. I'm either getting somebody elite or I'm probably just going to stream the position all year. In a best ball league where you have to draft multiple quarterbacks, he's a cheap, but he's an unexciting quarterback 2 or 3. But again, he's pretty cheap. And in a 2 quarterback league or super flex league, QB 24, QB 23 is about right when you see those names in front of him. Granted, he is a lot cheaper than a lot of those guys that are in a similar tier. So we're talking about names like Kirk Cousins, Justin Fields, Tua Tagovailoa, Trevor Lawrence, Jameis Winston, Matt Ryan, Daniel Jones, Zach Wilson, and Ryan Tannehill. All of those guys are in a very, very similar tier. Maybe they're all even in the same tier. And Mac Jones comes a lot cheaper than them. So it's fair to expect to grab him in the later rounds. Now, as for Big Mac's weaponry, let's start with his number 1 wideout in Boston last year, which was Jakobi Meyers. So last year, he finished as the wide receiver 32. He averaged about 11.8 PPR points per game. That said, he was never particularly trustworthy. He was definitely not explosive as a fantasy asset. He scored 15 or more PPR points in just 18.75% of his games. And he only hit 20 PPR points just once all season. Now, he certainly received his chances. He had the 19th most targets among wide receivers. He had 118 all year. And he had the 17th most catches among wide receivers with 79 all year. So 19th most targets, 17th most catches. However, he underwhelmed everywhere else. When you look at yardage, he only had the 32nd most, I guess, quote-unquote most yards. He finished with 797 yards. And most importantly, for fantasy football purposes, he managed to score just 2 touchdowns all year on 118 targets. For comparison's sake, for wide receivers who had 118 or more targets, they scored an average of 7.35 touchdowns. Okay, so they averaged just over 7 touchdowns, and Jakobi Meyers scored twice. Heck, even if you look at wide receivers that had between 100 and 117 targets, which is less than Jakobi Meyers had, they averaged 6.05 touchdowns. And Meyers had more targets and scored twice. So you give this guy those 4 extra touchdowns that we're talking about in the average, and suddenly he's the wide receiver 25 in football last season. Now, the good news is that when you look about regression always gets this negative term. People think, oh, this guy scored a lot of touchdowns, he's going to regress, he's going to come down. A lot of people don't realize regression works the opposite way as well. Regression can be a positive thing. It's all about regressing to what the mean and what the average is. So there is such a thing as positive regression that exists, and it's fair to expect, or it's fair to suspect, that Jakobi Meyers might have better luck finding the end zone if the Patriots are going to be passing more, and if Mac Jones improved as a passer. It's fair to expect that Jakobi Meyers is in for positive regression. Now, the bad news about Jakobi Meyers' situation is that DeVante Parker is, like I mentioned, the Patriots traded for DeVante Parker, and they used a second-round draft pick on Tyquan Thornton. So, last year, Jakobi Meyers got a 24% target share, and it's not entirely likely that he's going to get 24% of the team's targets again this year. So, what he might make up for in touchdowns, he should, I don't know if I should say should, but he might start to tail off in volume-driven metrics like targets and catches. Now, as for fantasy drafts this year, Meyers is currently the wide receiver 62. He's drafted around pick 135 in the 12th round. That's a value for a guy that just landed as the wide receiver 32 last season. I do like him in that range, particularly in PPR leagues. He's one of my favorite targets. He's mixed in there with Ronald Jones, Jamison Crowder, Van Jefferson, Darrell Henderson, and ironically enough, DeVante Parker. Now, DeVante Parker, unlike the team he just came from, right? The Dolphins, they now have Tyreek Hill, they have Jalen Waddle. Those guys cost a second and third round pick in fantasy football leagues. They're at a premium. They're insanely expensive. Both Jakobi Meyers and DeVante Parker can be had in the 12th round. So they're big-time value plays. Both guys are fair bets to emerge as the wide receiver 1. I think it's entirely possible that Meyers holds that role or Parker takes over as the wide receiver 1 in New England. And both guys can still be relevant even as the wide receiver 2. Even if it is Meyers, Parker can be relevant as the wide receiver 2 and vice versa. Last year, Mac Jones was able to support 2 wide receivers, even on a run-heavy team and as a rookie. So Kendrick Bourne was the wide receiver 2 last year. He averaged about 11 PPR points per game, which was good enough for a wide receiver 33 finish, which is, that's a back-end wide receiver 3. Interestingly enough, Kendrick Bourne was able to hit 15 or more PPR points in 25% of his games, and he was actually able to hit 20 points 3 times in 16 tries. Now, the best case for DeVante Parker is that he's the new team wide receiver 1, right? That's best case. Worst case, he's second in line. And as we've already talked about, Mac Jones can support 2 wide receivers. Now, in fantasy drafts this year, Parker is right by Jakobi Meyers. He's drafted as the wide receiver 64. He's in the 12th round, and that in particular is a value when you think about Kendrick Bourne finishing as the wide receiver 33 last year. DeVante Parker's last 3 finishes, even on the Dolphins, was wide receiver 41, wide receiver 42, and wide receiver 16. And again, the guy's being drafted as wide receiver 64. So something's got to give. There's got to be some value there. Kendrick Bourne basically can be ignored, unfortunately. Last season was fun while it lasted, but he did get moved down the totem pole when they did bring in DeVante Parker. When Thornton is ready to play, Bourne is likely going to be the first person to start ceding playing time to Tyquan Thornton. Bourne is the wide receiver 83 in fantasy drafts so far, around the 16th round, and frankly, I'm ignoring him, and I'm instead picking up some other names around there like Marlon Mack, Wan'Dale Robinson, Will Fuller, Raheem Mostert, Paris Campbell, Austin Hooper, Julio Jones, Carson Wentz, Mark Ingram, and several more. Kendrick Bourne is just completely off my draft radar this year, unfortunately. And as for the rookie, as for Tyquan Thornton, the absolute best case scenario for him in 2022, which, this in and of itself isn't even likely, but best case scenario, he's no higher than wide receiver 3 in New England. That role isn't very appetizing from a fantasy football standpoint. That role was Nelson Aguilar's last year, and he received 60 targets and about 7 PPR points per game, which was good, I guess, quote unquote, for a wide receiver 68 finish. So, out on Tyquan Thornton this year, but he is an intriguing hold in dynasty leagues for next year. And then last but not least, from a passing game standpoint, we should spend some time here on Hunter Henry. We were talking a little bit about positive regression with Jakobi Meyers. It's the potential opposite with Hunter Henry and Damien Harris, who we'll get to in a minute. Now, Hunter Henry, he was a touchdown machine in year 1 with Mac Jones. He scored 19 times, which tied for most among tight ends. He hit 10 or more PPR points in 37.5% of his games. I just knocked my note sheet out of the way here. Here we go. 10 or more PPR points in 37.5% of his games. He hit 20 PPR points 1 time. Now, the problem with those 9 touchdowns that Hunter Henry scored is that he did it on just 69 targets. Nice. That was the 18th most targets among tight ends. Okay, so to say it again, he had the most, tied for the most touchdowns, but had the 18th most targets among tight ends. So the volume doesn't look great. He was the 20th in catches with 45, and he finished 16th in yards with 517. He scored a touchdown on every 7.66 targets. So every time he got 7.66 targets, he scored a touchdown. Now, for comparison for you, 17 other tight ends in football had more targets than Hunter Henry did last year, and they collectively averaged just 4.4 touchdowns. And they scored once every 21.3 targets. So I'll say it again. Hunter Henry scored 9 touchdowns. Everybody who had more targets averaged 4.4 touchdowns. Hunter Henry scored every 7.66 targets. All the tight ends with more targets scored once every 21.3 targets. So it's crystal clear that Bill Belichick knows exactly how he wants to use Hunter Henry, and that's absolutely worth something when you look at the New England Patriots. But a touchdown ratio like that, where he's scoring every 7 targets, that is incredibly difficult to sustain, especially when they bring in somebody like DeVante Parker who can score touchdowns. So as you look at 2022, Hunter Henry is the 17th tight end off the board in the 13th round, around pick 152. Now, negative regression definitely seems likely, but that's still a tough cost to ignore, especially in best ball drafts where you know the guy's going to score touchdowns and you don't have to predict when that'll be. So I'm fine. I'm all in on Hunter Henry at tight end 17, specifically in best ball drafts. However, he's very touchdown or bust, clearly, right? The volume's not there, but the touchdowns are. So I love him in best ball where you don't have to predict those touchdowns. I'm not a big fan of him in redraft leagues where you have to pick and choose when you want to start him. I will likely be fading him in redraft leagues this year. Granted, my philosophy with redraft is always to either get an elite tight end or just ignore tight end completely and stream him all year. He'll be a great streaming option, but he's not somebody I'm going to rely on every single week. All right, hopping over to the backfield to close it out for the New England Patriots. Now, remember, the assumption that we're running on here is that the Patriots throw a little bit more and run a little bit less. Now, the first one to start with in that backfield is Damien Harris, right? Damien Harris was terrific. There's no way around it. He was terrific in his lone season with Mac Jones. He was one of those surprising pieces we were talking about earlier when it comes to, Patriots surprises last year. He finished as the RB17. He averaged 13.77 PPR points per game. He had the 11th most carries. He had the 8th most rushing yards. Most importantly, for fantasy football purposes, he had an insane 14 touchdowns, which was second behind only the GOAT, Jonathan Taylor. And I say that because I'm a Badgers fan. I know he's not actually the GOAT. Just run with me here. But 14 touchdowns for Damien Harris. Now, that said, his ceiling was a bit capped. So he only hit 15 PPR points just 35.7% of the time. And he only hit 20 PPR points just 14.3% of the time. He never once hit 30 PPR points. It was obviously a solid year. He was terrific. He found the end zone a ton, but it's really, really easy to fear regression, negative regression in a bad way here when you look at Damien Harris, especially if the Patriots do indeed run less than they did last year. So, for comparison's sake, 13 running backs last year had the same or more carries as Damien Harris, the same or more carries. They averaged 8 touchdowns, and that includes Jonathan Taylor. Okay, so 13 running backs had the same or more rushing attempts and averaged 8 touchdowns. Damien Harris, like we talked about, had 14 touchdowns. Okay. So if there is regression in that touchdown column, then you would expect Damien Harris to have to make up for that in the receiving column. And that's very, very unlikely to happen. Last year, he had just 16 targets all season. You have Rhamondre Stevenson in year 2. You have James White possibly coming back off the PUP list. You have Pierre Strong, who the Patriots use a 4th-round pick on. There's just not a lot to love here for Damien Harris as it pertains to picking up receiving work or being able to sustain his astronomical touchdown rate. In fantasy drafts, however, it seems like the public agrees with that. So he's currently being drafted as the RB29, despite finishing as the RB17 last year. He's drafted in the 8th round, around pick 94. And I admit that I cringe every time I take him, but that is a good price for him. 8th round, especially in best ball leagues where, again, you don't have to predict those touchdowns, and you know if he's going to maintain that red zone role, that's worth a lot in Bill Belichick's system. It always has been. You know, think about several years ago, LeGarrette Blount scoring I don't even remember, but double-digit touchdowns. If he has that red zone, if he has that goal line role, that's worth something in fantasy football. And if you can get that in the 8th round, especially in best ball leagues where you don't have to predict when that's going to happen, I've definitely taken my fair share of Damien Harris, especially because I'm typically a 0 RB drafter that loads up on wide receivers in the first 7 rounds. So I'm expecting regression, and I'm expecting a worse year than last year, but the price is right for Damien Harris so far here in 2022. As for Rhamondre Stevenson, last year he finished as the RB39, averaging 10 PPR points per game. He hit 20 PPR points twice in 11 tries, which is interesting because Damien Harris did it twice in 14 tries. He averaged 12.9 touches, 11.7 of which were carries. He averaged about 62.9 scrimmage yards, and he had 5 rushing touchdowns. So he was a guy that was just hanging out on the radar, but he was really only mostly valuable when you would expect Damien Harris to miss time. And again, this year, he'll be on the radar, and he'll be in the conversation for desperation flex plays come bye week time, but he'll likely need a Damien Harris injury to really come into week-to-week relevance as a fantasy football player. Now, that passing role, like we mentioned, it is up for grabs with Brandon Bolden out the door and James White likely to start the season on the PUP list, but a lot of reports are saying that Pierre Strong might be the front runner for that passing game role, leaving Rhamondre Stevenson basically as just the 1B to Damien Harris's 1A, which really isn't worth a whole heck of a lot in fantasy football. He'll need to either seize that passing down role, or he'll need to somehow pass Damien Harris with superior play or with injury. And then, on the optimistic side, it's not like Damien Harris is cemented as the RB1 or like he's this untouchable RB1. It's entirely possible that Stevenson finds a way to pass Harris, especially when you can consider the fact that Damien Harris is on his last year of his contract with the Patriots and very likely is probably on his way out the door if we know Bill Belichick, which means Rhamondre Stevenson might be the RB1 in Boston as soon as next year and possibly partway through this year. Now, when you look at current fantasy drafts for Rhamondre Stevenson, he's currently the RB38 going around pick 115, which is in the 10th round. I think that's fine for a guy who finished RB39 last year, but he's really, really, really tough to draft, especially when you see some of the names that are around there. Typically, I'm opting instead for Chase Edmonds, Rashad Penny, Michael Gallup, Rondale Moore, Tim Patrick, Kenny Golladay, Jarvis Landry, and other guys that are drafted in that range. He's just a little bit too expensive. He's a little bit outpriced for my liking in 2022 fantasy football. He's also drafted ahead of Dameon Pierce and Ronald Jones, who I think are in a similar tier, and I think it's better to just wait and grab those guys a round later or 2 rounds later. Last but not least, let's talk about that passing down role in the backfield. We're talking James White and Pierre Strong. Now, James White appears likely to begin on the PUP list, and ESPN's Mike Rice even went so far as to suggest he won't be on the Patriots come September. He left him off the roster projection. And if that happens, that opens up that passing down role entirely. And that role is absolutely worth something, particularly in PPR leagues. And it's said that Pierre Strong, the 4th-round rookie, is said to be in the mix for that role. Now, Brandon Bolden played it last year. He accumulated 385 receiving yards, which was the 9th most among running backs. The year before that, James White had the 10th most targets, 9th most catches, and 8th most receiving yards among running backs. And he was even better in 2019, where he had the 6th most targets, 6th most catches, 3rd most receiving yards, and 2nd most touchdowns. In fantasy drafts currently, James White is the RB63 around pick 208, which is the 18th round, and Pierre Strong is completely free, even on DraftKings, which is a full PPR league. To me, that's insane when you consider the fact that last year, Brandon Bolden didn't do anything particularly special, and he was still the RB48, right? And James White is the RB63, and Pierre Strong's later than that. In 2020, James White was the RB42, And in 2019, he was the RB18. And Pierre Strong is currently free. He's easily my favorite 20th round dart, 20th round pick that I throw a dart at. So that's a wrap on the New England Patriots. What are we at here? 30 minutes. Yep, it was a little bit more long-winded than I want, but the Patriots have a lot of different players to cover. Again, there's more in the article that I wrote, and the link to that article is in the description below. Or just go over to basementbrewedff.com and click on content, and it'll be the first article that you see. It's in the Patriots red and blue. You won't be able to miss it. There's a picture of Mac Jones on the cover. So please look, interact with it, give it a comment, share it with your non-competing buddies. And while you're here listening or watching, please, 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 it does so much more than you think. Please do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a review for the podcast, share it with your non-competing friends. And while you're here, let's hop over to Twitter and come hang out with me over there. On Twitter, I'm at BBFFMikey, and I love interacting with everybody over there. Next up on the NFL team previews list is the New York Jets to wrap up the AFC East. I will be getting that out here shortly within the next few days, and I will look forward to talking to you guys then. But until then, again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching. You're doing so much more for, a guy's confidence and a guy chasing his dream and trying to turn it into his career than you think. It might not feel like a big deal to you, but I promise you, every view, every listen, it's all life-changing for me. So thank you so much for being here. Cheers. This brew's for you.